Unit 5, Development Standards, Residential Structures, Foundation Requirements and Options. The foundation is the most critical element of flood-resistant construction because it determines the elevation of the lowest floor and provides the structural connection between the building and the ground. NFIP regulations allow several foundation types, but each has specific requirements and limitations. Elevated foundations on continuous walls, such as full basements or crawl spaces, are allowed but have significant restrictions. Full basements are below-grade enclosures that are surrounded by ground on all sides. The problem with basements in flood-prone areas is that they are inherently vulnerable to flooding and extremely difficult to flood-proof effectively. When basements are allowed, they can only be used for parking vehicles, building access, or storage. They cannot contain habitable space, and all utilities must be elevated above the base flood elevation. Basements must have adequate drainage around the foundation and may require sump pumps or other mechanical systems to remove water. Crawl space foundations are above-grade or partially below-grade enclosures that are less than full-story height. They are subject to specific requirements, including adequate drainage, proper ventilation, and construction with flood-resistant materials. The interior grade of crawl spaces must not be more than 2 feet below the lowest adjacent exterior grade. Crawl spaces must have flood openings that allow automatic entry and exit of floodwater. These openings must provide at least 1 square inch of opening for every square foot of enclosed area, with a minimum of 2 openings on different walls. The bottom of openings must be no more than 1 foot above the lowest adjacent grade. Elevated foundations on open foundations such as posts, piers, columns or piles are generally preferred in flood-prone areas because they allow floodwater to flow underneath the building without causing structural damage. These foundations can be constructed of various materials, including wood, steel, concrete or masonry. Open foundations must be designed to resist flotation, collapse and lateral movement during base flood conditions. This requires careful calculation of foundation loads and flood forces, typically requiring professional engineering design. The foundation must be anchored to resist these forces and must extend deep enough to provide adequate bearing and stability. Slab-on-grade foundations place the building directly on a concrete slab at ground level. While this approach is common in non-flood-prone areas, it is generally not recommended in special flood hazard areas because it makes it difficult to achieve the required elevation without significant amounts of fill. When slab-on-grade construction is used in flood-prone areas, the slab must be elevated so the top is at or above the base flood elevation. This typically requires imported fill material, which must be properly compacted and engineered. The use of fill is restricted in floodways and may require compensatory storage in other areas. Elevation requirements. The most fundamental requirement for residential construction in special flood hazard areas is that the lowest floor must be at or above the base flood elevation. Understanding what constitutes the lowest floor is crucial for compliance. The lowest floor includes the floor of a basement, but also includes the floor of any enclosed area below the base flood elevation that is used or designed to be used for living purposes. This includes finished areas in crawl spaces, below-grade garages that could be converted to living space, and enclosed areas under elevated buildings. In coastal high-hazard areas, V-zones, the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member of the lowest floor must be at or above the base flood elevation. This means that floor joists, beams or slabs must be elevated above the BFE, not just the finished floor surface. Enclosures below elevated buildings are allowed, but are restricted to parking vehicles, building access or storage uses. These areas must be built with flood-resistant materials and must have flood openings for automatic equalization of water pressure. Many communities adopt freeboard requirements that require buildings to be elevated above the base flood elevation by an additional safety margin. Freeboard of 1 to 3 feet is common and provides additional protection against floods that exceed the base flood and against uncertainties in flood elevation calculations. The elevation requirement applies to the entire building, not just the part in the special flood hazard area. If any part of a building is in the SFHA, the entire building must meet elevation requirements. This prevents situations where part of a building is compliant while another part is vulnerable. Utility protection requirements. All utilities and service equipment must be designed and located to prevent water from entering or accumulating within the components during base flood conditions. This requirement applies to heating, ventilation, air conditioning, plumbing, and electrical systems. Furnaces, water heaters, washers, dryers, and similar equipment must be located at or above the base flood elevation. If this is not practical due to building design, the equipment must be designed and installed to prevent floodwater entry and must be anchored to prevent flotation. Electrical systems require special attention in flood-prone areas. Service panels, meters, switches, and outlets must be located at or above the base flood elevation. When equipment must be located below the BFE, it must be designed to prevent water entry and must meet special electrical codes for wet locations. Plumbing systems must be designed to prevent sewage backup during flood conditions. This might require backflow preventers, special drainage systems, or other protective measures. Water supply systems must be protected from contamination during flooding. Fuel storage systems, including propane tanks and oil tanks, must be anchored to prevent flotation and must be protected from damage by debris and other flood forces. Underground fuel tanks are generally not recommended in flood-prone areas because of the potential for flotation and environmental contamination. Manufactured home requirements. Manufactured homes, also called mobile homes, present special challenges in flood-prone areas because of their lightweight construction and typical foundation systems. NFIP regulations include specific requirements for manufactured homes in special flood hazard areas. All manufactured homes placed in special flood hazard areas must be on permanent foundations and must be elevated so the lowest floor is at or above the base flood elevation. The foundation must be designed to resist flotation, collapse, and lateral movement, which typically requires extensive anchoring systems. Manufactured homes must meet the tie-down requirements of the community's building code and must be anchored to the permanent foundation system. The anchoring system must resist wind forces as well as flood forces and must be designed by a professional engineer in most cases. Replacement manufactured homes are subject to the same requirements as new installations. This means that if an existing manufactured home is substantially damaged, it must be replaced on a permanent foundation and elevated to meet current standards, even if the original home was not elevated. The permanent foundation requirement typically means that manufactured homes cannot be placed on temporary supports like concrete blocks or adjustable steel pedestals. The foundation must be constructed of materials and methods suitable for permanent construction. Accessory structures, such as garages, sheds, and pool houses, have somewhat relaxed requirements compared to residential buildings, but they still must meet specific standards. These structures are typically smaller and less critical for life safety than primary residences. Accessory structures that are 600 square feet or smaller and valued at less than a specified dollar amount, varies by community, may be constructed with the lowest floor below the base flood elevation if they meet certain conditions. They must be used only for parking vehicles or storage, must be built with flood-resistant materials, must have adequate drainage, and must have flood openings. Larger accessory structures must meet the same elevation requirements as primary residences. This means the lowest floor must be at or above the base flood elevation unless the structure qualifies for the small accessory structure exception. All accessory structures must be designed to have low flood damage potential and must not be used for human habitation. They must be constructed with flood-resistant materials below the base flood elevation and must have utilities above the BFE. Accessory structures must be located and constructed to minimize flood damage and must not cause additional flood hazards to other properties. They should be positioned to allow flood flows to pass around them without creating damaging velocities or debris accumulation.